I'm sure that everybody is familiar with all of these virtual protocols, as it has been about 2 years now that we have been having all these virtual meetings and workshops and forums. But of course, we have to still ensure that we go over them just to give you a little bit of a reminder. I hope everyone has their microphones muted. Of course, in Zoom, that's the symbol to mute your microphone and to stop or share your video. So if you will need to ask the question during the session, please ensure that you unmute your microphone, and if you want to share share video at that time, of course you are encouraged to do so as well. You can, of course, raise your hand and the meeting host will call on myself, or either the presenters will call on you to make your intervention as needed. I want to encourage everyone, if you have not, if you do not have your full name displayed on your Zoom profile, could you kindly display your full name as well as the an abbreviation for your country, as this will assist us when we are doing the breakout groups. So kindly display your full name on your Zoom profile, as well as the abbreviation for your country. And as I said, that will assist us with the breakout groups that we're having a little bit later on. Just to go over the agenda for today, there will be a little small change in the agenda for today. Of course, we're starting right now at 8, between 8 and 8:10. We have welcome 5 C's by the 5 C's. And continuity with the previous session in February, preliminary introductions and establishing workshop protocols, which we're doing right now. The first presentation will be the GCF concept note development introduction to the climate rationale, which will be presented by Mr. Ryan Zuniga. And then there will be a practical session following, where we will have the breakout groups, and you'll be guided briefly through developing a situational analysis, or at least the components of a situational analysis. The second presentation will not be the logical framework. We have a change, so that will be presented tomorrow by Dr. Daniel. Instead, today we are going to have presentation 3, which will be moved up from tomorrow to today. This is the GCF concept note development project program description and project results alignment with the GCF investment criteria, which will be presented by Mr. Vincent Peter. So that's the slight change that we have. Everything else will remain the same. As well, that will be followed by a practical session. So at this time, I would like to introduce Mr. Vincent Peter, who is the lead for the 5 C's in this project, to give you a brief introduction and to further the continuity with the previous session that was held 2 weeks ago. Vincent?
Thank you, Keisha. And good day, colleagues. Let me welcome you once again, and thank you for being here and participating. At the end of the last day of session 1, I provided you with a succinct preview of what to expect in session 2, which starts today. So starting from today and over the course of the session tomorrow, we have, as it were, a real treat in store for you. We will be discussing what are arguably the most important elements in preparing a project funding proposal, a proposal that is based on the nexus between climate change and health. And to do this, we will be looking at the following seminal topics: the climate change rationale or justification for the project. And that discussion will be led by Mr. Ryan Zuniga. We had, as Keisha mentioned before, a slight shifting of the agenda. So today we will be looking at the project results alignment with the GCF investment criteria. And basically, this will be about ensuring that activities outcomes are aligned with the GCF investment criteria. Now, it is called GCF investment criteria, but basically it is used by other agencies as well. And the essential consideration of this topic relates to the viability of the project. Tomorrow, we'll be looking at the theory of change, which is the basic proposition as to how the activities proposed will address the problem, and particularly the proposed development pathway, whether it be low emission or climate resistant development, and to show the link between that theory of change, or TOC as we call it, and the logical framework for the project. And last but not least, because they are among the most important considerations that go into developing a project proposal, we will be looking at key gender and environmental and social safeguards. And this discussion will be led by Mr. Ian Morrison. Now, just a little bit more, what we are undertaking here is aligned with pronouncements and commitments that coming out of the most recent COP, right? Where the countries agreed to a COP26 health program to build climate resilient and sustainable health systems, which are our countries subscribed to. And just to illustrate, if you like, a little more the link between that, the provisions of that COP26 health program and what we're doing, under commitment area 1 of that COP26 health program, there is a commitment to conduct climate change and health vulnerability and adaptation assessments, which is, we spoke a lot about in session 1, and these are planned for some of the countries as well. And we have a commitment to develop HNAPs, the Health National Adaptation Plans, which the operatives in the health sector will be well familiar with. And most importantly of all, a commitment to use those V&A assessments and the HNAPs in order to be able to access climate change funding for the health sector, which is at the heart of the matter of dealing over the next few days. So our efforts over the course of this seminar, and indeed the lifetime of this project, will aid our efforts in the direction of fulfilling those commitments which are enunciated in the COP26 health program. We stressed before that this seminar will be interactive, and I certainly look forward to your active participation and involvement. Over to you, Keisha.
Thank you, Vincent, for that brief overview of the activities we'll be engaging in the next, today and tomorrow. So we're running a little slightly behind schedule, so let's get right into the first presentation. I will invite Mr. Ryan Zuniga, who is a project development specialist here at the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. Ryan will be guiding us through the introduction to the GCF concept note and the developing of the climate rationale and situational analysis. Ryan, are you ready?
Yes, thank you, Keisha. Good morning, everybody. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes, yes.
Yes. All right. Good morning again, everybody. Today I'll try to walk you through very quickly how it is that we develop the climate rationale. As Vincent just said, and based on the conversations that you've had in the first session, how it is that you now take all that information, especially when you look at things such as your vulnerability analysis or things that are articulated in your HNAPs. How do you tell that story to the GCF to convince them that the issues that you want to address via a concept note or a full funding proposal is inherently caused by climate change and is aligned with their investment framework or investment criteria, which is something that you'll be discussing next. All right, I hope this will be very interactive. If there's anything that you want to share, just stop me at any time. If there's any concept that I explained that's not clear or you would like a bit more information on, feel free to chime in the conversation. All right, so what are we going to look at today? We're going to look at some key terms, the importance of the climate rationale, a bit of how it is that the climate change impacts the health sector. We're going to look at building that climate rationale for adaptation, building that climate rationale for mitigation projects, and the all-important principle of additionality, which is that principle that the GCF looks for or funds the initiatives that you're going to put forward on. All right, so just to kick things off, looking at the interaction between the climate system and health and how this works. We're going to look at key terms such as vulnerability, exposure, so keep these things in mind. Risk, but this diagram gives you a very good overview of the different processes that occurs when you look at mitigation, when you look at adaptation, when you look at impacts, when you look at our ecosystems and the different systems that we have, our health systems, how these things interact with each other. What is the different impacts that you get from that interaction and how you address them. So this just gives you an overview of the how you start to think when it is that you are approaching the issue of creating or developing a climate rationale. And I know it looks like a lot of different things happening, but we're going to break these things down one by one. And hopefully at the end of this presentation, you understand how they interact with each other and the results that you get from that interaction. One of the most important things, and I'm sure you've discussed this a lot, and we've discussed this in everyday conversation, is the whole issue of risk. And from the IPCC AR6, which is the assessment report, risk is defined as the potential for adverse consequence for human or ecological systems. And understand how that works, understand that risk also provides a framework for understanding the increasingly severe and interconnected impacts on climate change. That is the element that we want to start to bring out. We want to start to look for information as it relates to risk. We want to start to have that discussion as it relates to risk, particularly risks that we see in the health sector as it relates to climate change, right? So risk is one of those terms that we will talk about. We will have a conversation about, and it's also something that you need to define and provide examples of when it is that you start to articulate your rationale. Hazard, which is defined as the potential occurrence of natural or human induced physical event or trend that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, as well as damage to loss to property, infrastructure, livelihoods, service, and other things, right? And so in the context of the discussion, in the context of climate change, the risks can arise from interaction among climate hazard, the exposure, which is another key term, and vulnerability. which is another key element that we will need to go a little bit deeper in as we start to articulate our rationale. All right, so I just want you to keep these terms in mind. Keep in mind how they're used as it relates to climate change, and start to think about the information that you would need to bring out to justify your own project ideas or your project, if you have any project concepts, to just ensure that it's aligned with what you already have. So we move on to exposure, which again, for me, it's simply if you're in the way. It's defined as the presence of people, livelihoods, ecosystem in places that are settings that can be affected. So if you're in that part of the structure. Vulnerability, again, there's several different components to vulnerability. We use this word a lot, but so the definition in the IPCC AR6 is as defined as the propensity and predisposition. So your propensity and predisposition, which looks at your magnitude to be affected and how often you will be affected to a particular risk or hazard, which is that interaction with your system. So the hazard comes after the risk has interacted with one of your system, your social, your environmental system, whatever it is that's going to be affected, and encompasses a variety of concepts, elements, including sensitivity, which is something that we will pay attention to, susceptibility, and the lack of capacity to cope with that. Right? Adaptation, I won't go into this much, but it's basically how it is that we respond, and I think there have probably been several discussions around this. The interaction between exposure and vulnerability and how that leads to adaptation or maladaptation in some cases. And so for us to just keep these things a little bit in mind. And this leads to the whole issue of resilience and how we build resilience and how it is that resilience is defined as it relates to climate change and impacts of climate change. So I know that was a mouthful. It was very quick. The information is there on the side, and this will be shared with you, but it's just for us to start to have these conversations around these key terms that will be used later on. Right? So in summary, we look at this relationship between exposure sensitivity, which then determines your potential impact. So your exposure, again, if you are in the way, if you're on the front line, your sensitivity is mainly related to the magnitude to which you'll be affected, how sensitive you are to a particular hazard, and your potential impact. So once you look at your exposure and your sensitivity, it speaks to that potential impact, how much you'll be impacted by that particular hazard that you're looking at. And then your adaptive capacity, can I respond, can I cope, will then lead to an element of your vulnerability or some factor of vulnerability. All right, so we're going to build on this. So we understand this, we understand our exposure, we understand our sensitivity. We know a little bit about our adaptive capacity to that potential impact that we've now been able to derive through discussion, through analysis, through those same vulnerability analysis and assessment that was done or will be done for the health sector. We now understand what these things are. So how do we communicate this to the GCF? Now, we communicate this to the GCF through this thing called the climate rationale. And as was said earlier, the climate rationale is that story that you tell the GCF to get them interested in what you want to do, because you're telling them that what I am bringing forward to you, this project, is consistent with your investment criteria, but more so is inherently caused by climate change. So climate change is what is causing this. And while it might manifest in several different sectors in several different ways, you could demonstrate to the GCF that this is inherently caused by some impact of climate. All right, there's several ways to do this. At the end of the day, you just want to demonstrate your things that we've discussed before, such as your sensitivity, your exposure, your adaptive capacity, your lack thereof, and you want to demonstrate that to the GCF and tell them that you need help. So, however, this is not the only way to get this done. What I'm going to walk you through is what are some of the information that is important for you to have in your climate rationale. You could use this step that I'm going to present. This is what I use when I build out these projects. But if there is another way which you're able to tell the story a bit better, you could feel free to do so. It's dependent on the project. It's dependent on the type of activity. It's dependent on the impact. It's dependent on the geographical location. So you will want to take a way or a method which most suit what you're presenting to the GCF. So any questions so far? Is that clear? Any concerns? Can I continue build on this? Okay. I'll take that as we're crystal clear. So what does the climate rationale? Why is it important? So key things to remember is that it draws on credible science. So you must provide some sort of data to justify your claim. So if you're saying that because of an increase in, and then we're going to discuss this a little bit more, but if you're saying because of increase in flooding, there's issues. So, okay, here's a hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ryan. You mentioned earlier the risk comes before the hazard.
Yes, the risk.
But I'd like to think that the hazard is continuous. It's always present continuous.
No. So, all right. Let me. So the risk is, so the hazard is created by this. If you're looking at climate change, when you talk about, we'll use hurricane for example. Hurricane is a hazard. All right. Hurricane does not become a disaster until it interrupts with a system, your social system, until it makes landfall, basically. That becomes a disaster. Then that creates, so because hurricane exists, which is your hazard, you are able to determine your risk, which is tied into your propensity and your predisposition. So how often does the hurricane occur in your particular area? How sensitive am I to be affected by hurricane? And once you look at that interaction between your sensitivity and your exposure, it then determines an element of your risk. How much will I be affected, or what is my risk of being affected by that particular hurricane? Is that a little bit clearer?
Well, it was always clear. I'm just concerned about how we prioritize systems. Well, it's basically a systematic. Disasters is part of a system. So prioritizing the risk, the vulnerability, the hazards at different levels would seem to suggest that they are disjointed.
Okay.
As against that they all appear happen at the same time simultaneously.
Is it only me, or can you speak a bit louder? I'm not hearing you well.
Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
I'm not sure why. Is that better?
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I'm just concerned about us trying to dissect the different components involved in a vulnerability hazard in a disaster condition.
Okay.
Go
ahead. Sorry.
When everything happens simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. And
trying to prioritize the different elements involved in a disaster. Okay. will maybe lead to some psychological decrease in importance of one factor over another. For example, vulnerability is a component of risk, and also in the context of hazard, because you may be vulnerable to flooding but not to hurricane. So there are a lot of nuances involved in trying to maintain that systematic approach to vulnerability and disasters in general. So I think the hazard, which is always present, but not in every location at the same time, once we focus more on the human side, because I think so far the narrative is very climate ecological focused, and we have less focus on the human component, which is where the focus should be. Because we try to understand climate change without trying to understand human behavior, which is in fact the problem. Which I think if we shift the focus a bit more on the human side, which is hazard, which is vulnerability, which is also risk, then maybe we will see some change in, well, some upward movement in some of the negative effects that we have. Hope I was clear.
Yeah.
Clear.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that intervention, and I take your point. I think maybe I was not clear in saying that. One, understanding the different elements as you explained, we're not prioritizing one over the other, but we need to understand the interaction between these elements to justify to the GCF, or to tell the GCF that the problem that we have is inherently caused by climate change. That is the primary role and responsibility of the climate rationale. When we go to the human side, when we talk about our vulnerability, when we talk about our impact, this is where we start to highlight we start to justify the measures, we start to justify the activities that we're going to put forward. But we also show the GCF that based on these changes in climate and the impacts that these changes bring, it enhances our vulnerability. It makes us a bit more vulnerable, and hence the reason why we need this project, hence the reason why this project is important and we need your support to implement this project. And so simply put, that's the story that we're trying to tell during in the climate rationale. So we're going to get to the aspect of vulnerability. We're going to describe our impacts. We're going to describe all of these social and human elements of climate change. But for us to get there, we must demonstrate to the GCF that the start of all of this is a change in climate. And because of that change in climate, there is a particular impact or impacts that I need to address because it enhances my vulnerability or it creates vulnerability, right? And so that is the conversation that we're having. So we're not prioritizing these elements of climate in terms of your hazards, your risk, but we need to understand what creates them. How do they interact with human system? Where do they come from? What changes or particular changes in climate creates them? And that is what the GCF is asking us to do when it is that we build out our climate rationale. Was that a little bit more clear? But we're gonna get there. We'll come to that aspect in a few. All right, but in summary of that first part of the presentation, we need, these are some of the things that the GCF looks for. And I know we keep using the word GCF, or we keep referring to the GCF, but this is information that you could use to develop any climate-related proposal. The GCF, from my experience, is a bit more stringent in terms of that, in terms of demonstrating the climate aspect than other resource partners. But once it is that you use this particular template or or you look at the problem in such a way, as if you're responding to the GCF, it gives you an opportunity to bring out a lot of the information that is necessary to channel these projects in any other direction. But as I said, it draws on credible science. So this is me now going back to the climate rationale. It draws on credible science. So you need to demonstrate some scientific basis for your claim. So if it is that you're talking about rainfall and flooding has caused issues with fresh water, And that has now led to an increase in water-related diseases because there's little to no access of fresh water. You must demonstrate to the GCF some sort of trend in flooding or changes in precipitation patterns. You must draw on that science to provide that information there, or to justify that claim, I should say. As was said by Mr. Bailey, the impacts on the vulnerabilities are very important, that social or human side of things. So based on whatever impact that you've had, whatever climate impact that you have, how have that exacerbated my vulnerabilities? What is the direct impact to my system, my social system, my environmental system, my economic systems? What is that impact because of this climate hazard or disaster that interacts with that particular system? So what happens because of that interaction? You then look at some measures. What are the measures to address these impacts? You want to be very simple in your simplicity in your approach. You want to make sure it's structured well. Hence the reason that I said earlier that it's all about telling the story, and while I'm presenting a way of how you tell that story, you want it to be fit for purpose. So you want to take this method that I am sharing with you today and apply that to your own particular project, and make use of common standards of measuring impacts. And this is when we start to talk about things such as the sensitivity, exposure, and some of those terms that we discussed before. All right. So with that said, why is this important? And we've started some of that conversation. Right? It allows the reader to understand the climate context, which is very, very important for the GCF. They will tell you there's a difference between a development project and a climate project. And climate project is what we've come to be, or what we're used to in project development. Most of the projects that came before the advent of the GCF was while it addressed the environment, was not very focused on that climate side, that climate context. It was development somewhere, or a high percentage of it had a development context. The GCF is saying that we are not a fund that looks at that. If it is that you can't demonstrate to us that your problem that you're going to address is climate in its origin, it's inherently caused by climate change, this is not something that aligns with what we want to support. And so that is why the climate rationale is very important. It provides a guide for the design for the intervention. So once it is that you are able to demonstrate that impact of climate, then it provides a basis for you to start that conversation around what are the measures that I am going to take to address this issue. And you start to bring out or highlight the different intervention. It must be consistent with location. So keep that in mind as we move forward, and specific climate realities to help draft a sound rationale. All right. The GCF funds climate change adaptation and mitigation. So we're going to look at both of them. The rationale must be clearly defined at the concept level to receive a positive feedback. Some of the information for this you could find in your NDCs, your NAPs, National Determined Contribution, your National Adaptation Plan, which is something that you'll be working on, your national communication, which countries submit to the GCF, I think every 2 years it is. And any sectoral plans and strategies, and of course the IPCC reports, the ER5 and now the ER6. You could find a lot of the information to justify some of the projects that you want to put forward. So we've discussed why is it important? What are some of the terms? What are some of the conversations you must have? So how do we do this? It's one thing to discuss what is needed, what is information that you need to put in. But what I want to walk with you today is actually how it is that you get this done. And again, feel free to chime in, feel free to participate participate in the discussion. If there's anything that you need me to clarify or any question that you ask or anything that you disagree with, feel free to come in, and so let's have a discussion about it. So the first thing we want to do is have a good understanding of the impacts of climate change in the health sector. These two diagrams outlines a bit what are some of the impacts and what are some of the considerations that you can start to have if this is related to your project or to your problem, to the issues that you want to address. So we look at, we see this word vulnerability coming up again, where it is that we're looking at extreme weather events, heat stress, air quality, so water quality and quantity, food security, and vector distribution. This was something that was produced by WHO. Look at the vulnerability factors, which is that human element or that social side when you talk about demographics, when you talk about geographic location, biological factors and health status, socio-economic factors. You look at the health system in terms of the governance. Maybe there's some challenge with the coordinated mechanism, the health force, health information system, essential medical products, technologies, finance, and service delivery. And you look at how these systems interact with your exposure pathways, which is what we discussed earlier, some of your vulnerability factors, and you start to see what are some of the climate sensitive risks. And having a good understanding of this allows you to demonstrate clearly to the GCF or to any resource partner, what is it that I want to address and why is it that I think this is important for us to address this, right? You also have certain climate changes also linked to events such as freshwater shortages, droughts, extreme weather events, change in distribution of infectious disease, displacement of people, food security, and so things such as temperature-related illness and death, increase in waterborne illness, spread of infectious vectors, injuries and illness due to extreme weather events, wide range of impacts from air pollution. And these are just some of the impacts, some of the issues as it relates to health and climate change. You guys will know better than myself what are the challenges that you face within that sector due to certain impacts or due to certain changes in climate. And so having a good understanding of this, starting with this discussion, puts you in a very good position to start to demonstrate to any resource partner, in this case the GCF, what are the issues that I have, why I have these issues. Right? Any questions? All right. So the WHO also have certain specific areas. They have 10 here. These were recommendations that was made at COP26 in the special report. I just have this here for information purposes. So when it is that you start to build out your rationale, if you could align some of those activities or those targets with what was presented in this report, it gives you a bit more basis, or it gives you a bit more standing in demonstrating to the GCF how it is that your project contributes to this strategic document. And that's something that we're going to discuss a little bit more later on. So the conversation that we had earlier was focused around risk and vulnerabilities. Again, the vulnerabilities result from that interaction between your climate-induced hazard, your system. In this case, we're looking at the health sector and health services. What is the risk to that, to the functioning of those systems? What type of vulnerabilities that create? So understanding that interaction, understanding how this plays out is key, and we must demonstrate that. But before we demonstrate that, we need to tell the GCF what is happening, what will happen due to climate change. And this is just the specific climatic changes that have occurred and will continue to occur that will, induce these risks or exacerbate these vulnerabilities. And of course, what is the additionality of the proposed interventions due to climate change? And again, we're going to get to that. So this is the first reading we're going to cover. All right. So having a strong evidence base is particularly important, and we discussed this just in the context of climate change adaptation projects. So you start building your rationale, or I start building my rationale on describing what are the main climatic variables. Is it precipitation that is causing this issue, or changes in precipitation? Is it a change in temperature? Sea level rise? What is the main climatic variable that is observed and projected for a specific year? Again, keep in mind, you want to be as specific as possible for a specific region. In certain cases, you might not have that level of data, but you also want to identify that you will provide that later on. You want to tell the GCF that this data is missing, I don't have it, but I have intentions of providing it. You don't want it to look, you don't want your rationale to look as if there's a gap. It is not something that you have not considered. So where you don't have the data to justify, ensure that you highlight that it's not because I don't know what I'm doing, or I don't know that I need to provide this, I just don't have it at this point in time. So key things to look at, or key things to note: climate change versus climate variability. The long-term changes versus those extremes. Your hazards, so we see hazards or drivers that comes back. So understanding the relationship between these, being able to demonstrate that is very important. So this is where I would normally start. And again, you want to be very specific. So you're not going to describe all the hazards, but what you describe is those that are key to your vulnerability, those that are key to the impacts that you're facing and the impacts that you want to address. All right. So after we've done that, we now ask ourselves, what are the climate-induced risk and vulnerability based on these changes in climate that we have described, right? So, for example, beyond the increase, and this is just an example here, beyond the increase in temperature, climate change in a given location, so whichever location you're working, is expected to cause changes in rainfall patterns. So we have now demonstrated to the GCF that the issues that and again, we should have done this from here, so our climatic changes that we described should have been related to changes in rainfall. And so we're saying that these changes in rainfall and causes increased incidences of droughts. Drought conditions have increased the risk of wildfires and dust storm. So we have now made that link between the specific climate change or the climate changes in climate to what is now, how is that impacting us? What is the impact? And so we're saying because of the changes in rainfall patterns, we've had no prolonged drying days, and some of us describe that as drought. And because of these drought conditions, we see an increase in these drought conditions. There's an increased risk of wildfires and dust storm. And we know, so that is one aspect. But why is that important? Why is the risk of wildfires and dust storms something that I should be concerned about, something that I would want to address? All right, and we move to then, what are the climate change induced risks and vulnerabilities? You go a little bit farther. So because of these dust storms and because of these increasing risk of wildfires and dust storms, we now see that particulate matter is suspended in the air for these events irritate bronchial capacities and lungs. This makes chronic respiratory illness worse and increase the risk of respiratory infection like bronchitis and pneumonia. The increased frequency and intensity of these incidents caused by climate change emphasize the urgency to build resilience in the health sector. Now, so that is how we start to build this out. Dr. Bailey, is it clear now where the vulnerabilities come in and how it is that we highlight the elements of vulnerabilities on the human side of things?
Very clear, sir. Thank you very much. Very clear.
Thanks. So just to take a step back, and I'm taking steps back because we're going to continue to build. So if there's any concern, if there's something that's not clear, please reach out. So again, quick recap. We discussed the changes in climate, what happens because of those changes in climate, and why is that important? How does that affect human health? How does that affect us? These changes that we want to address, why is it important for us to address? All right. And so a very important aspect of this, which also demonstrates the importance of your project, is what happens if we do nothing? What happens if we understand this is an issue, we know that this is an issue, we're being affected by this, but we do nothing, we don't take action. What is the cost of inaction? And so to demonstrate that and to demonstrate why this project is even more important, we have a conversation around, and this is, again, this is where the data is available. We have a conversation around future climate and climate models. So if we're saying that observed climate, which we're looking at here, is going to cause these things, if we do nothing and the future climate is telling us that the inherent cause is going to become worse on the future climate, then you could see how we start to make a case for why this is increasingly important. Go ahead, Dr. Bailey.
Okay, if I may chime in again, don't want to disrupt your flow at all. I realize you haven't mentioned anything about urbanization or land use, which is the basis for the dilemma in the Caribbean that we're facing with climate change. Is that we haven't really appreciated the dynamics of urbanization in the Caribbean, which is a whole level of other discussion that needs to be brought into the fold, because it is the issue, it is the real issue. Because that's where our land use challenges are mainly visible in our urban centers.
I really like that thought, which is outside of this. The two things, I really like that thought. At the center, we're working on something which looks at that. But we're also coming to that, and keep that comment in mind, right? So we refer to that as non-climate impacts, right? But we're coming to that, so keep that in mind, and I'll come up to you in a few. All right. So just to go back to the presentation, modeling future climates, looking at climate projections, and to look at how that is going to worsen or exacerbate the impacts that I'm already being felt or is already experienced on the ground is very important, and it's something that you could use to further justify why it is climate change or addressing the climate impact is necessary, right? So again, quick recap. We understand the changes in climate. We understand what these changes cause. We understand how we're being affected from this. So we've demonstrated this to the GCF. We've also provided a paragraph or two on what happens if we do nothing based on future climate change. But the one of discussions we also need to have, and how we tie all of this in together, is how resilient our human and natural system. So what is the ability that we have to respond to these? How resilient are the human and natural systems to climate-related impacts? Again, you see words such as exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity of a system will determine the vulnerable of the natural and human systems to climate change. All right. Also keep in mind, when discussing this, we want to start to think about the needs to the system to build its resilience, and keep that word in mind, needs, because we're going to come to that a little bit in a few. But we've demonstrated the impacts, the changes in climate. We've demonstrated the impacts. We've demonstrated the vulnerabilities caused by impacts. We've also demonstrated to the GCF. So you could think about this in paragraphs. So you provide a paragraph or two on each of this. We've also demonstrated what happens if we do nothing. So that's we looked at future climate. We look at if under climate models, we're seeing projected climate will have such and such an impact. So if we're already seeing this change with observed climate and we're saying that this will become worse, this would also worsen the issues that we're having. But we also want to discuss then, what do I have at this point in time in terms of my ability to respond? How does my resilience look, or lack thereof, to these issues that I have demonstrated? So you want to speak about why I cannot respond to this, or some of the challenges that I'm having to respond to this. And in describing your resilience, you want to look at these two things, your needs and your barriers. So if I outline that I do not have the technology necessary to address the issue, so there's a need to provide this technology. But what is the barrier? Why don't I have it? What is causing me from not being able to source that particular technology? Is it a financial issue? Is it an issue of coordination or lack thereof in terms of cross-ministry coordination? What is the barrier that prevents me from responding to the needs outside of the GCF intervention? So why is this not something that I am not doing on my own? And that further justifies why it is that these activities are important when you get there. Because the activities should be focused on these barriers. The activities should be focused on removing the barriers so that you're able to source the needs, that you're able to provide the needs, because these barriers to those needs are no longer there. Is that clear? Okay. So how do you demonstrate this? When a system is expected to be exposed to drought and sensitive to it, the vulnerability of the system, the climate-related drivers would be evaluated as high. And how I would write this, I would say maybe without appropriate adaptation measures in place X, so you go back to your particular areas that you're going to address, that particular geographic location, number of people, communities. Again, this is where you start to talk about your project beneficiaries or the people that you're trying to help. Dependent on the specific system, would be adversely affected. In this case, we're looking at droughts, wildfires, and different respiratory diseases. So we start to look at people in the communities who is affected or will be affected. We start to demonstrate that this number will grow if we don't do anything. And we don't have the necessary measures in place to respond. And then we start to outline. So what are the needs? What do we need to put in these measures? What are the barriers to these needs? So even if we know what we need to put in, why can't we do it? And the project sits in that place between the needs and the barriers, to remove the barriers to provide your needs. And so when you start to speak about your activities, when you start to describe your activities, it must be linked to this rationale, particular to the areas of needs and barriers. And my colleagues will walk you through how you do that in the other presentations. Right? Honorable mention. What are, again, and here we have it, what are the adaptation needs of the particular system in light of the projected hazard and vulnerability of the system? What are the main barriers to implement those adaptation activities that will address the climate change? And to get back to your point, Dr. Bailey, what are the non-climatic drivers of change? Land use, population growth, these are things that are very, very important for us to look at when we're developing rationale, and even when we're developing the activities. However, these are things that are not inherently caused by climate change, but will exacerbate the issues and the vulnerabilities that you have if you don't consider it. So make sure to highlight the overall socioeconomic situation of the country, including information on non-climatic drivers, education, population increase, resource use, or bad resource management, because there's an issue with resource management that is not directly linked to climate change. If you're not managing your resource properly, it's not a climate change issue, but a management issue. Maybe it's a coordination issue. You'll exacerbate the potential impact of climate-related drivers. So those non-climatic drivers, and explaining how these non-climatic drivers fits within that issue of vulnerability that you just explained, or relates to it, is important for you to provide the information. Questions, comments, concerns, emotional outbursts, anything so far? Is this clear? Are we clear?
And Ryan, are we almost at the end of the presentation? We're a bit over.
Yes, just give me 3 more minutes. I see a hands up.
Okay.
Mr. Watson?
Yes, good morning, and sorry if this has been addressed because I've been in and out. How do you, on this topic about, the main drivers as well as non-climatic drivers, any strategies on how do you handle issues related to energy and pollution as a result of energy, not greenhouse gases, but particulate matter?
Okay. Go ahead.
I'm saying particulate matter and other sorts of, aerosols that may cause respiratory and other kinds of issues.
Yeah. Your question is directly related to the example that we used earlier on in terms of risk for respiratory infections and bronchitis, pneumonia, and that sort of thing. As it relates to the non-climatic drivers, once it is that you build your rationale around impacts and vulnerabilities, and that is inherently caused by changes in climate, you start to pull out those specific challenges that you will have that are directly related to climate change. But in assessing those impacts, you know that there are key things around those things that you need to address to make sure that your project is sustainable, to make sure that your project is going to be transformative and impactful beyond the implementation period. And so those key things are usually related to your non-climatic drivers, such as population increase. We had the example of urban planning and land use, management, coordination. These things are all important and very important to ensure that the measures that you're going to take will work, but they are not specifically related to climate change. So showing that relationship and describing that relationship is important. When it comes to energy, and your question brings me to my next slide. So that's nice, but if we have a mitigation project for health sector, then what do we do?
I think we're back to the main group now.
Yes, we are. Before we continue, Keisha and Mr. Peter, I spent some time in each of the groups while you were discussing, and I think that it's important to inform participants that the presentation by Dr. Kane tomorrow will take a further step into fulfilling out this baseline framework. So you can take some time tonight and go through it, add your thoughts, and come prepared tomorrow after Dr. Kane's session or during his presentation to ask whatever questions that you need to clarify at the end of his presentation. And if you're a little bit confused, I'm sure after his presentation tomorrow, some of it will also be cleared up.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Yes, and as I mentioned to my hello.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. As I mentioned to the group that I was in, that yes, you can use the baseline framework for your as a homework and look at it. And also, if you have persons within the group from the same country, maybe you can have one idea or work on it individually and further populate the situation analysis for tomorrow. So we will now have the next presentation, move into the next presentation. We're a bit behind schedule, so let's go to it as quickly as possible. And this presentation on the GCF investment criteria will be done by Vincent Peter, who you met already. He's the lead for this project, and he's a project development specialist at the 5 Cs with wide-ranging experience in the public sector, comprising of a mix of national, regional, and international experience. His areas of specialization include program and project planning, management, and implementation, strategic planning and resource mobilization, enterprise development support services, capacity building, and monitoring and evaluation. So Vincent, you ready? Pass it over to you. Hi, Vincent, are you there?
Mr. Peter, you are muted.
All right, so am I being heard now?
Yes.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
All right. This technology always gets me. Is my screen, is my presentation being seen?
Yeah, yes, but in presenter's view, it's not. We're seeing your notes too.
So
It's not in the
slide
presenter's.
presentation.
No, yeah, that is it. We're seeing it now. I'm
Okay.
seeing just the slides.
Slides
the
and you're not seeing my presentation.
Not the notes.
My notes.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Yes,
So
correct.
and I need to make up some time. So I will endeavor to do that as much as possible. So this is expected project results. You're expected to show in this section of the concept note, which is section B3, right? How your results align with the GCF investment criteria. And before I go into that deeply, Keisha, Michelle, I would suggest that about 3 minutes before my time is up that you signal me, right? And also in terms of making the connection between this presentation and what is to be done by Donil. Basically, after one has considered the climate rationale, we always recommend that you start with the theory of change, which Donil will deal with. And the reason for this is that the theory of change allows you to set out your project, right? Both in terms of diagrammatic form and a narrative of what the elements are. And you can see the logic of the project in terms of how inputs, activities will contribute to outputs, how those outputs will contribute to outcomes and the goal. And so you have a snapshot of that. And from there, after you've done that theory of change and all of the stakeholder engagement that goes into preparing it, you then look at the other elements of the concept note, right? Such as your sustainability, justification, and this one, which is in alignment with the investment criteria. So you have on the screen there right now the snapshot of the section, a picture image of the section of the concept notes that pertains to the GCF investment criteria. And there are 2 guidance notes there on how to complete that section, right? The first one identifies the 2 pathways by GCF, used by GCF to fulfill its mandate, which is to combat climate change using the pathway of either limiting or reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is the mitigation aspect, and the second one, building resilience, which is adapting to climate change. Now, the IC, the investment criteria, the IC, as I will call them for short, they are generic, of course. And in this particular case, since we are dealing with the health sector, they would have to be, the responses in relation to these would have to be specifically tailored to the health and wellness sector. The second sentence that you see there, or paragraph if you want to call it that, lists the 6 investment criteria, of which there are 6. and I'll just call them quickly: impact potential, paradigm shift potential, which is also known as the transformational shift, your sustainable development potential, responsiveness to recipient needs, promotion of country ownership, and the efficiency and effectiveness. That is the 6 investment criteria. And the purpose of this presentation is to present the general considerations that pertain to each of these criteria in turn. Now, when you're doing for the purposes of preparing this section, right, of the concept note, at this stage, what you really have to present is a condensed, convincing summary of the key features of your project that will demonstrate application of each of these criteria. The more detailed elements of which I will go into in a bit. All right. Now, before we start off, a few general observations with the status of the health and wellness sector. I call it today as you see, but from the literature, there appears to be the suggestion that the health and wellness sector, health systems are not climate adaptive and not climate resilient. Few communities are protected from health and well-being risk of climate change. And this is the last one is an emission consideration. The emissions from the health sector facilities are about between 4.4 to 4.6% of worldwide emissions. So if we're talking about that, mitigating the impacts of climate change, there is an opportunity there for mitigation activity in that sector, which can help to bring, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so if we move on to the next slide, some of the barriers to adaptation and mitigation that are spoken about in the health and wellness sector include limited awareness and information on the health risks of climate change, right, within and outside the health and wellness sector, insufficient technical knowledge and capacity, insufficient surveillance and monitoring of climate-sensitive health outcomes, limited expertise in data management and analysis, of course, related nexus between climate change and health, limited efforts to build partnership and collaboration with local communities in this combat with climate change, and of course, very importantly, limited resources available to the health sector per se. So with that, I will go now into the investment criteria itself and give you a general overview. When projects are submitted to GCF for funding, they are assessed. One of the important areas in which they are assessed is according to the 6 investment criteria, which I mentioned before. These ICs, as I call them, rank high among the considerations for evaluation of a proposal by the Climate Investment Committee of the GCF. And a favorable investment of this aspect of the proposal is among the most important factors for approval, favorable consideration of your project by the GCF. My second point here, I have investment and I have investment bold and underlined, and that is deliberate, right? Because it's important to understand, and this is the first important takeaway that I want you to go away from this presentation. That in the ultimate analysis, proposals are evaluated as investments. I repeat, proposals are ultimately evaluated as investments. A lot of standard investment consideration apply, including value for money, sustainability, maintenance.
Hello everyone, I'm sorry, right? I cannot hear you. Is there any disturbance or?
No, is that the same for, am I being clearly heard?
I'm clear, Vincent.
Same here. Yeah, I'm clear. I'm hearing clearly.
I'll try to speak a little louder. I think that was Kenzie, so that to see if you can hear. But as I mentioned before, in terms of investments and the fact that what will happen after that investment, the project has been undertaken and the funds have been invested. What is the plan for post financing, right? What is the extent of co-financing that will be provided in support of the investment? it is important to point out that these appraisal considerations, these IC considerations that I will outline, present general principles of appraisal, right? That is, they applied across the board, whatever the sector, program, or project. And of course, since we're dealing with the health sector, they must be tailored according to the specific requirements of that sector. All right. Are you hearing me any better, Kenzie? I'll move on. So, as I said before, any proposal that you submit, it must be able to demonstrate that it can be justified based on the requirements of the 6 investment criteria. And I'll just read through them quickly in turn. The first one, impact potential. And this is the summarized definition, of course, which we'll go into a little more detail a little below. Your impact potential relates to the quantitative and qualitative information on the potential impact of the project and how it contributes to the achievements of GCF objectives and results areas. That's criteria 1, impact potential. The second one is paradigm shift potential. And that is one of the most important ones, this transformational shift one. And you have to provide an indication of the degree to which your project can catalyze impact or action beyond the one-off investment, beyond the project itself. So you invest in that project and you must be able to demonstrate that, look, that this project is going to bring a paradigm shift, it's going to bring about transformational change that will impact way outside just the parameters of this project. Third one is sustainable development potential, and that is how the project aligns with the sustainable development goals. And also, what are the project's wider benefits and priorities, including environmental, social, and economic co-benefits of the project. Very importantly, in our current context, what is its gender-sensitive development impact? That is always a fundamental thing that is looked for and scrutinized. You must be able to say, what is the gender impact that the project is going to have? The fourth is responsiveness to recipient needs. Does your project fulfill the vulnerability and financing needs of the beneficiary country, the intended beneficiary country, and the population in the targeted group? Fifth, country ownership. Does your project foster and promote country ownership? And that means, is it aligned with national policies, strategies, and framework national climate strategies? Well, for example, your National Adaptation Plan, your NDC, right? Is it aligned with that? Does it help to advance these? And very importantly, the extent of the country stakeholder engagement and involvement in developing the project, as indeed the capacity of the country to implement that project. You must address that within that criteria. And then, of course, the last one, which is efficiency and effectiveness, and that relates to the financial and economic viability of the project itself, its financial soundness, its cost effectiveness, return on investment, and of course, extent of available co-financing. So we'll deal with each of them in turn, starting with the first one, impact potential. Here, you have to describe how the project contributes to achievements of GCF's objectives and results areas, of which there are 8 results areas. 4 are mitigation and 4 adaptation, and also the fund level impacts. The mitigation and adaptation impact of a project refers to how the project will contribute to, and I mentioned this before, a shift to a low emission sustainable development pathway, or a shift to climate resilient development pathway, which is your adaptation component, and requires you to explain how what will be the expected mitigation and or adaptation impacts of the project in quantitative and qualitative terms. Now, there are 8 GCF results areas. And I can go through them quickly, and some of them you would recognize would fall squarely within some of the considerations that you would want to adduce in relation to the health sector. So for example, energy access and power generation, which, you know, one of a question was posed on that in relation to Brian's presentation earlier. Low emission transport, forestry and land use, building cities, industries and appliances. That may have a lot to do with, that particular last one may have a lot to do with the health sector, because in the health sector, we're talking about a lot of infrastructure. The adaptation result areas of them are health and well-being and food and water security. So that's a natural link right there. The second is most vulnerable people, communities, and regions. The third is ecosystem and ecosystem services and infrastructure and the built environment. So I'm sure you can see in the adaptation results areas a number of things that have pertinence and resonate with the situations in the health sector. Now, these result areas are linked to indicators, right? And these you would have to give an indication of how whatever you're proposing, whether it's on the mitigation and adaptation, what is the indicator that will show that your project will actually have achieved those things at the end? And some of the important ones on the mitigation, I will just mention a few of them, can't go into all, is expected tons of carbon equivalent, right? CO2 that is reduced or avoided. And of course, that's a clear mitigation, right? Reducing the amount of carbon. Expected increase in the number of households with access to low emission energy. That in a way has an indirect link to the health sector, because if you can address that situation, you know, energy is an important enabler of attainment of good health indicators. Expected decrease in energy intensity of buildings, cities, industry, appliances, and I mentioned that before in terms of what you could regard as a relatively high contribution of health facilities to greenhouse gas, right? Sorry, I skipped over something there. And of course, in terms of adaptation, you need to clearly set out the specific risks on the current and future conditions of climate change. So we moved away from mitigation. This is the second result area. That adaptation now is about building resilience, building the adaptive capacity of countries and communities. And in making the case for that here, you have to present observed, you know, historic climate change for the country, or the historic and projected climate change, right? For the country or community, example, projected changes in temperature and rainfall, right? You have to show that your project is appropriate, both in terms of geographic and temporal scales, right? For the initiative. It ought to address both slow onset and rapid onset climate-related hazards, here very importantly, and the impact of these climate-related hazards on the target area and the country in terms of loss of life, value of physical assets, livelihoods, and or the value of environmental or social cultural assets. All of these are valid indicators in terms of pointing out the number, the value that your project will add, the potential impact that your project will have. There are many examples, but I can reference, for example, a project that was approved recently for the Federated States of Micronesia, where it, for example, looked at, and it was an adaptation project, and it looked at basically developing integrated climate and health information systems and implementing what they refer to as on-the-ground adaptation interventions in priority vulnerable communities to cope with vector, water, and foodborne diseases, which I think we all are very much aware of these and the types of impacts that they are having in our countries, and the way, in fact, climate change, the vagaries of climate change is for the most part exacerbating the impacts of those variables on our countries and communities. So much said for impact potential. I want to move to now paradigm shift potential. And this, as I said, is one of the most important ones. All right. And a lot of emphasis is placed on this. It is often the most rigorously questioned and scrutinized investment criteria, as indeed the whole proposal, right? And I'll basically deal with mention some of those key types of factors that illustrate or demonstrate paradigm shift potential. Very importantly, one of the most important, headline one is innovation. And that relates to how your project create or help to adopt new technical or business improvements, right? And business here does not necessarily mean merchandising, but it means in terms of how the affairs in the sector is run and is operated, right? It includes, for example, the adoption and development of new technologies. You may adopt, you may integrate new technologies into your operation, or new models of operation, which can help you access new market segments or address key barriers, right? The next one is, and this again, I remind you, is a facet of paradigm shift. And that is the potential for scaling up and replication of the proposed project, whether within a sector or other sectors. That's the important scalability aspect. So if you propose a project in one district, it can be scaled up in another district, or even another country, or even another region. If you can demonstrate that, or you can export key structural elements of the proposed projects elsewhere, whether same country, sector, region, or country. That is a very important dimension of paradigm shift. The next one is contribution to climate resilient pathways, right? What is the potential for expanding your project impact without equally increasing its cost base? And that's a basic cost efficiency issue there. And the second one I mentioned before about being able to export the key structural elements to other initiatives and sectors and regions and countries. And what is the degree to which the intervention reduces proposed risk, right, of investment in technologies and strategies that promote climate resilience, for example. The other element of paradigm shift that I want to mention very quickly is related to the potential for knowledge and sharing lessons learned. And at the heart of it is the contribution to the creation or strengthening of knowledge, collective learning processes, or institutions, right? So the lessons learned from that project or program can be replicated elsewhere. Of course, the existence of a strong monitoring evaluation plan and a system, and a plan for sharing lessons learned so that they can be incorporated elsewhere, must be a strong dimension of the project. Another paradigm shift potential, and as I mentioned to you at the start, this one is the most heavily scrutinized one. It's the most, perhaps I would say, is arguably the most important investment criteria, right? And I think I've given you enough reason as to why it is that way in terms of the different dimensions of it. the contribution to the creation of an enabling environment. So what would be the arrangement for the continued financial sustainability of key outcomes and activities in the long run beyond the project, right? Including, for example, a strategy to identify or secure additional public or private funding. That's very important. And also the market development and transformation impact of your initiative, if any. For example, whether it contributes to new skills in the job market, for example, through capacity building, right? Business activities at the local, national, or sectoral levels, for example, for companies, equipment suppliers, insurers, service providers that were not previously existing. So if it is able to usher that in and can some way contribute that, then that's an important dimension to mention. And importantly, the question of de-risking, right? Reducing the risks and the costs and eliminating barriers to facilitate solutions, whether it be low emission or climate resilient solutions. Okay, and the contribution to the regulatory framework and policies. If you can demonstrate measures to achieve a systematic mainstreaming of climate change into the country's regulatory frameworks and policies. And I was in a group where it spoke of the regulations relating to planning, for example, do not take the issue of the existing and potential impact of climate change into consideration. And so that is the degree to which the project can advance the regulatory or legal framework to make them more responsive to and to promote low emission or climate resilient development. That's an important paradigm shift potential. Moving on. So the next one is sustainable development. And I've gone through three. That's three, that's halfway. So are there any no, I've gone through two, but I'll basically, if there's any feedback or burning question or clarification on the other two, I can perhaps treat with that very quickly before moving on to sustainable development criteria, investment criteria. Are there any? If you're not hearing me, then I can probably just move right along. Okay, going once, twice, three times. Okay, no feedback. All right, so the next one is sustainable development. And basically, how will the project support or contribute to sustainable development? And in particular, how it contributes to the priorities enunciated in the sustainable development goals that the country, prioritizes, right? And there are I think 17 of these sustainable development goals. So if you can show directly which ones, right, and how it will contribute to each one in turn, again, that's a very good case in terms of your sustainable this particular criteria. And of course, also under this criterion, it has to show other benefits, what are called co-benefits. So for example, economic co-benefits. Is it creating jobs, alleviating poverty? Is there income enhancement, financial inclusion, especially for women, right? These are important economic co-benefits. Social co-benefits, whether there will be improvements in health and safety, access to education as a result of the implementation of this project. Environmental co-benefits, whether there will be improved air, water, and soil quality, conservation, biodiversity. Very, very important and useful. And of course, the all-important gender empowerment, right? Reducing gender inequality. That now takes me to the fourth one, which is the responsiveness to the needs of the recipients. And here, basically, you have to identify how your project will actually help the deal with some of the the vulnerability that you are pointing out, that the country, beneficiaries, communities, the risks that from climate risk that they are experiencing, and how your project will help to attenuate these, help to resolve these. The VNA assessments and the HNAPs that are currently being produced and in some countries are already being produced should provide some valuable insight into what those vulnerabilities and needs are, and they can then be referenced in terms of your proposal for consideration. In this section, you have to give an indication of the level of the economic and social development of the country and the target population. Your project is intended at a target group, at a target audience, if you like, and it must be able to describe the situation of that country or community or group in relation to that that specific matter. How the project provides an opportunity to overcome specific barriers, especially to financing, right? Which we know is very important. You can't undertake any investment, right? That unless without financing, right? And that's very important. But there are other barriers as well. There may be political barriers, right? And administrative risk, right? Question of social acceptance, even corruption and governance may be a barrier. There are operational barriers, right? That you need to reference. And of course, the financial barriers relating to currency risk, revenue risk, capital costs, and risk and so on that you have to reference. And listed here also is opportunities to strengthen institutional and implementation capacity. And the group I was in, that was definitely referenced as a factor. The question of the institutional deficiencies, inadequacies that are hindering addressing the problem. I just have about 5 more slides to go, so don't get perturbed. The next one is criterion is country ownership, right? And as I had mentioned before, it refers to the country community ownership of the project, right? And that country ownership is demonstrated by ensuring that activities, firstly, the activities of your project and the results, their output, outcomes, and results, the goal align with the strategic national objectives and priorities of the country and help to advance action, whether on adaptation and or mitigation, right? The project must be shown to be coherent with and aligned to and contributes to the country's climate strategy and priorities. Very importantly, you can't have something that left field. It must be, it can show the clear alignment and linkage with your NAMAs, your nationally appropriate mitigation action, your national adaptation plans, nationally determined contribution, right? Your national communications to the UNFCCC, right? Your GCF country program. If you have a country economic and social development plan, which then recognizes how vital it is to mitigate generally to the existing and potential impacts of climate change. That must be clearly enunciated within the proposal, right? Other dimensions of that you have to show in that section relating to country ownership, right? If there are non-climate change specific policies that are pertinent, you have to show how it is linked to this, the experience and track record of the accredited entity and your executed entity who will have to implement key elements of the proposed project, the experience in being able to do that, the fit, the qualifications to do that must also be demonstrated. Stakeholder consultation, engagement, very, very important. And of course, the level of engagement of your NDA, which I have there, but that means your authority in the country, right, for GCF matters. As a lot of you may know, you may not be able, you can't make an application to the GCF unless you get an approval, national designated authority from your GCF, from the NDA, who say that yes, this is in line with our planned program for the utilization of GCF funds, and it fits in with the whole country ownership, and therefore we have no objection to granting you of the GCF considering this project. So you have to get the NDA approval. In a lot of the countries, for example, you have the Ministry of Economic Affairs or Development and so on, the NDA. So you must ensure that the NDA is always involving and aware of the development of that proposal. So when the time comes, you would not have a problem getting the assent to send it to the GCF. And the last investment criteria, and I have just 2 more slides after this, relates to efficiency and effectiveness. Now, overall, and I mentioned this before, efficiency and effectiveness criterion is about demonstrating value for money. Demonstrate that, plain and simple. And there are various, there are financial and economic analysis that are to be done, not necessarily at this stage of preparing the concept note, but if the project gets to the stage where the concept note has been approved and it is approved to go further, to develop, to do all of the background information, prepare the background analysis, to prepare a full funding proposal to submit it to the GCF, that will be a very important aspect. And that's a very large part of the full funding proposal itself, demonstrating value for money. You also, if you can demonstrate co-financing, right? Well, what amount of money that you are able to bring to the project itself, along with what you are requesting, whether from the GCF or from other donor agency. The GCF love co-financing. That is like, second nature to them. They want to know how much money are you bringing to the table in terms of implementing this project. I mentioned before, and I don't need to repeat about the economic and financial analysis of the project, how important that is. That is an element of the efficiency and effectiveness criterion, but it is something that comes more when you are going to the stage of doing your background analysis to prepare the funding proposal. But you still need to, to give, at least some sort of insight into what you see as to how the financial and economic analysis will basically support the implementation of your project. And of course, the fourth issue here in relation to the adequacy of the proposed financial structure, the financial structure that you are proposing for the project, right? The amount of money, the type of instrument, whether it be grant, right, etc. Loan, right? The GCF have a number of instruments that they issue called equity, guarantee, right? Grants, loans. They have reimbursable grant, non-reimbursable grant, right? The length of the duration in the case of, for example, a reimbursable grant or loan, the duration of the time period to repay, and the terms and conditions that are applicable to that reimbursable grant or that loan. Continuing on with the question of efficiency and effectiveness, only because it is so important, right? I've listed it here in terms of if you want to make sure that you're on the right side of that criterion, here are some of the key important boxes that you need to tick. financial adequacy and appropriateness of the concessionality that you are requesting. And GCF terminology, that basically means grants. How much grant money are you requesting for this project to make the project viable in a way that you are, and at the same time, keeping an eye to ensure that you are not crowding out the possibility of any private or public investment in the project, right? And if there are any, you need to highlight any existing financial bottlenecks or barriers that will be addressed as a result of the implementation of the project. Cost effectiveness, and that is for mitigation projects only, right? The reduced emission ones, the total funds invested vis-a-vis the expected emission reductions compared to an appropriate benchmark. So there are benchmarks in terms of, if you invest this amount of money, how many tons of CO2 you expect to reduction in CO2 you expect to achieve, right? The total direct financing compared to the expected emission reductions. So that is your cost effectiveness sub-criteria. The potential to leverage and or catalyze further investment. Again, that is a mitigation a sub-criteria specific to mitigation. And very much to show, well, look, how if you implement this project, then it's going to catalyze a series of other initiatives that overall will conduce to, in this case, mitigation, to emission reduction. So you can think of an investment in power, right? In power supply, and how that will trigger other investments, mini grids, investment in other forms of energy supply, and how that will contribute to a reduction of overall mitigation in the country. Of course, I need not say a lot about financial viability of the project, both in the short run and in the long run, and because that goes without saying. That is key towards the viability of the project. And linked to that is your expected economic and financial. It says internal rate of return, but all of your other indicators of economic and financial performance of the project, so NPV, IRR, etc. And it would be important if you can demonstrate that through this initiative, you are applying best practices and the degree of innovation of the initiative. That is linked, of course, you remember that term innovation from paradigm shift, right? The second criteria. And basically there you will try to describe how the best available technologies and or best practices have been considered and are being applied within the context of the project. And importantly, including those of indigenous peoples and communities. It may be that for a particular initiative, an indigenous solution may be best rather than bringing in something from outside. That I have covered all of the 6 investment criteria, and I thank you for your time, your patience. If there are any questions you want to raise or any observations you wish to make at this stage, they are welcome.
Hello, Vincent.
Yes. Go ahead, teacher.
Oh, sorry. Hi, Vincent. Sorry, I was not hearing. Is there anybody that have any questions for Vincent?
No question. I must have bored them or baffled them. So,
very comprehensive presentation, Vincent. I think you outlined well the different investment criteria. So I guess that's why there are no questions. Vincent, given that we did not have Dr. Kane presentation today, which was going to focus on the log frame development, and then we would have had the practical session where we looked at the baseline logical framework again. Would it make sense for us to have the breakout groups, or rather we were thinking we could just have some of the persons from the breakout group share their project ideas and the situational analysis that they had started to develop, and maybe get a feedback from Ryan and yourself this time that we have now between 10:30 and 11.
Sorry, Keisha, you're saying we have about 28 minutes or so?
Yes.
Okay.
So yes, I was saying whether we should have the breakout groups, given that Dr. Kane's, we didn't have Dr. Kane's presentation as yet. So or perhaps we could just have the person share their a few of the ideas that came out of the first breakout session, and then have you and Ryan give some feedback on the climate rationale, situational analysis, and also the how it fits with the GCF criteria.
Okay, so I think a bit of a discussion. The engagement would be very useful. Okay. So I agree with the approach. Okay. I don't know what Ryan has to say on that.
Yeah, that works for me also.
Okay, all right. So at this time, then we will shift a little bit with the presentation, with the agenda. We're not having the breakout group, but we had a few, well, I know in my group, which was group 3, we had at least one project idea from St. Kitts and Nevis, from Mr. Sylvester Bell. So maybe we can start with him, and then we can maybe have two or three more project ideas from the other groups, and then get some feedback from the project developers in how you can further develop the situation as well as fit with the GCF criteria, further align with the GCF criteria. So we have a volunteer to go ahead and share a bit about their project ideas and what are the climate, the situation and the climate, how you're looking at the developing the climate rationale. It doesn't have to be anything detailed at this time.
Okay, for more group, Sylvester Bell here again. I wasn't taking note. I was speaking, but I wasn't taking note. But if I can recap briefly, our project seeks to improve energy efficiency within the health sector, and directly related to transferring to a greener supply of energy for the entire health sector. We do have 24 health facilities for about 25 health facilities, 4 major hospitals which operate 24/7. Sorry, my phone is in. Which operates 24/7, and about 17 healthcare facilities. The problem is we are totally reliant on the usual government supply for electricity, and this is a demanding task force in terms of meeting all our needs for electricity. If there is to be an impact on the healthcare facilities and the electricity goes, then we can all see the effects or the impact that will have on operations as well as individuals who access care. And so if transitioning the economic considerations as well, the environmental consideration in terms of emissions, we can visualize having these amount of facilities operating 24/7 on fossil fuels. And so if you can implement a project under this program to transform the health sector to a more reliable, renewable supply of energy.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bell. Do we have any feedback from you, Ryan, and from Vincent in terms of how we can further develop the situation analysis and aligning with the GCF criteria for this project idea?
Thanks, Keisha. Thanks for that presentation as well. I think it provides a very good example of what a mitigation project would look like. One of the things, just a few pointers for certain information that you would need to highlight. Having a good idea of what is the total kilowatt hour for the sector, for each hospital, and then you sum that up by the amount of sectors, by the amount of hospitals that you have, or clinics, to have that overall idea of the total sum and to have a total idea of how much of that you plan to offset. It might not be 100%. You might need to consider some sort of mix in terms of your energy generation potential. You may be able to look at solar. There may be some opportunities for waste of energy if you generate enough medical waste, and there's some technology which you could identify to turn that into the energy. But just having a very good understanding of what is the amount of kilowatt hour you will offset. There's an emission conversion rate, which the country should have. You should find that in your NDC, which then allows you to convert that kilowatt hour or megawatt hour, whichever one you want to use, to CO2 emissions that you would offset. So those are just my general comments at this time. Just what some key things you could use to strengthen your case. Over.
Thanks, Ryan. Vincent, do you have any feedback for Mr. Bell and St. Kitts and Nevis potential project?
Sorry, go ahead, Vincent.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to share, I just found a document which was an energy audit for our main hospital, the Joseph and France Hospital here in St. Kitts from 2018. And just to be brief, the average annual consumption, 1,706,442 kilowatt hours. That's the annual consumption. Average energy cost, $468,987 US. That's the result of the study. And average annual carbon emission kilo, 1,179,663. So this is just for one facility, our primary hospital here in St. Kitts.
I think one of the things that I must mention is most renewable energy projects are seen as income generating projects for the GCF. And so it requires a bit of co-financing. The GCF will see this as, while it builds the energy security of the sector, and it contributes to overall resilience and has the co-benefit of reducing CO2 emissions. It still is seen as an investment project, as an income generating project. So demonstrating what you will do with those cost savings is also important. If it's something that's going to be used to further invest in climate action, you may want to consider looking at something such as a revolving fund or something of that sort. And again, you'll get into this later on when you work with Dr. Kane. But the more you're able to demonstrate the benefit of those cost savings to the public sector, the less you may require to come up with co-financing. But most energy generating projects are seen as income generating, and it requires a heavy bit of co-financing for it to respond to that effectiveness and efficiency bit that Vincent discussed in his presentation. Just something to note. But there's a very good case and potential for renewable energy and those sort of action based on what the information that you provided over.
Thank you, Ryan. Vincent, did you have something to add?
No, I would not. I would not add to that. I think Ryan has set out the essential considerations in relation to that project as a mitigation project, as indeed any other mitigation project. So I would not add anything else on that.
All right. Have an idea from another group who would like to share at this time?
Yeah.
Keisha.
Hi. Hi, Ian.
Hi, good morning. I think I can't talk for the person for Chris, but in our group we had two discussions. One was from Sylvester from St. Kitts, and the other was from Chris Ura from UA Trinidad and Tobago. But what was interesting that he had a project that related to disease control or disease mitigation or minimization, and it had to do with solid waste and the issue, the prevalence of the possibility of contracting leptospirosis from rats within the solid waste. I am not sure. I know the project is not advanced, and based on what Ryan said, while solid waste may have an issue related to energy generation or renewable energy, it is seen as an income generating project. So to what extent you frame these projects to make sure those are the issues or the issues that you're facing, the impacts are climate related, because in some instances, climate related impacts are indirect. So while we have issues related to climate change, and it will affect marginalized groups more so than the groups that have the capacity to mitigate, or you would say their vulnerability is less because they have the means and the ways to mitigate. In some instances, will further marginalize people. So the climate change is maybe not directly related. How would you respond to that? And Chris may be able to help if he's still on.
Thank you for that, Ian. Thanks, Chris, for that, if you're still there. Pollution and climate change is an ongoing discussion. Some see pollution as not directly linked to climate change, as you rightly said. It's more an issue of bad management or waste control, more so than inherently caused by the impact of climate change. This is something beyond waste management. The conversation goes beyond solid waste management. It's also something that's a debate when it comes to water pollution as well. If you have an increase in pollutant in water, is that climate change, or is that maybe something like land use or one of the other non-climatic factors? I think what's important is if you could demonstrate what is the relationship between change in climate and the vector that transmit this disease. Do you have an increase? Is there some evidence which shows that increase in temperature increases the proliferation of rats, or shorten the gestation period of rats, which then leads to an increase in their population? Maybe if that is possible, and if there's evidence to suggest that, you may want to take that angle to build that case out. Secondly, when I say these things are not inherently caused by climate, that is one aspect. But it doesn't mean that you cannot put the project forward. It means that these things that you have identified that are non-climatic in nature would require a higher level of co-financing. The GCF will only seek to fund those that you could prove that is a direct relation of climate. But once it is that you could build a project and it has these elements, you would just need to see if it is that you could identify funds for that particular portion, which is not necessarily climate in nature, from somewhere else, from a level of co-financing, and those that you could directly link to climate change can be, you could request support from the GCF for. So that would be my initial feedback on that one. Oh.
Thank you, Ryan. Chris, did you want to add anything? I see you have your video on.
Yeah, just thank you very much. I just had a quick question about the climate rationale for this kind of project. Because one of the key things that we need to obviously address is, as you've said, is how much would climate change add to the problem? And that's very critical for, it seems, the GCF to have that information. And sometimes these kinds of projects, it's quite difficult to have that data. Or we need to actually develop some kind of pre-project to actually generate that data. Are there any opportunities through the GCF fund to have a sort of, I don't know, a pre-project or smaller project where which might be focused around getting together and generating data you would be able to then put towards a larger project in a particular area? Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. Yes. So there's a PPF facility, project preparation facility. The GCF provides up to 1.5 million USD per project, and to do exactly what you just outlined, to provide the data necessary to justify the claims that you're making in your concept note. I think key to receiving this is, like I said, to demonstrate in your climate rationale that it's not because you don't understand that this data is necessary, but the data is not available at this moment in time. So it doesn't seem that there's a gap in your thinking. There's not a gap in your analysis, but simply that you don't have the data. Secondly, you could also address this through the readiness program. So the GCF provides $1 million per year, and that's a renewable sum of money. So every year the countries get $1 million for them to do, just as you outlined, to get that data together, to ready themselves as the program implies, to move on to a larger project. So putting these things in place. So there are two funding windows that you could use to mobilize funds to get this done.
Thanks very much. And another quick question, if I may, on another important angle is the innovation, which you and Vincent mentioned. With a project like, for example, we're looking at Lepto or something. Obviously, one of the keys is the multidisciplinary approach, or like One Health approach to address the problem. Would you, in your experience with GCF, could you consider, or would they consider the approach that you're actually proposing to be the innovation?
Vincent, you could answer this. My quick answer would be yes. If it's transformative. So when you look at the approach, if it's moving away from business as usual, way of addressing the issue, and it's something which speaks to a higher level of efficiency, a higher level of reducing your carbon footprint, because maybe somewhere along that value chain, so to speak, you could identify pockets of where you could reduce your footprint. That approach, yes, can be seen as transformational. You can include aspects of new technology, new ways of communicating, getting that information out to your beneficiaries. Those are some of the things which you could use to strengthen that approach to highlight the transformational aspect. That would be my short answer. Over to you, Vin.
Yeah, I endorse that that general what you've outlined, and you were asking Chris specifically in terms of the approach. And certainly it could be the process or the end product. I mean, the activity, the process, the output. Once it will result in a change that is aside from business as usual, and you can show clearly the resultant benefits of doing so, I would say most definitely. At the end of the day, it's how you make the case for it, if you like, the business case for it, and you sell it. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, I think we have time to share one more project idea. So perhaps from one of the other groups, do you have a project idea, or countries, do you have a project idea that you discussed within the breakout groups? Or maybe you worked on by yourself individually? You can share it and get some feedback from the two project developers.
Anything from group 4? I'm yet to hear from the best group, which was my group.
Could you repeat, Ryan? I didn't hear you so well.
I was asking for somebody from my group, which I said was the best group. I'm yet to hear from group 4.
Oh, okay.
And I know that Brittany lamented the fact that the discussion ended too early. We had a very lively discussion, but the main person there was, in terms of the scribe and the presenter, who left a bit earlier. But I don't know if I can invite, Brittany, put you on the spot a little bit and invite you to, talk about some of the things that you all are doing in the Bahamas. My apologies in advance.
Sure, and I see two of my colleagues are also online, so feel free to jump in. But the project idea that we had put forth was the strengthening of a climate surveillance system that will be able to serve sort of like an early warning system where we're able to map the climate risks. And so we talked about things like the impact of storm surges that can flatten, and we've seen flattening of healthcare facilities in the past. The linkages between temperatures, increasing temperatures on specific health outcomes like heat strokes and exhaustion, etc. And also, as a part of that conversation of surveillance, was the need to strengthen the way that we're able to track people throughout the health system as they move from island to island post climate disaster, and being able to track their medical progress. And I do know that there is a project that's ongoing right now through the readiness, GCF readiness project, that's looking at, one component is looking at strengthening the surveillance mechanisms within the health sector. Some of the challenges that we highlighted or discussed earlier would have been around raising awareness, firstly, with the linkages between climate change and the health impacts, as well as building up the human capacity to be able to do the work. In general, there has been acknowledgement of some deficits in the technical capacities in country. So that might be one of the barriers. But of course, to address that barrier, we had talked about, the way that opportunities like today, where we get training and exposure to the various approaches to be able to develop concept notes, is a strategy to build that institutional capacity at the local level. Some of the other groups had also mentioned challenges around poor urban planning, and use of land space in terms of where it is that health facilities and other facilities are constructed and the impacts that changing climate is having on their ability to continue to function and operate, considering sea level rise, flooding, etc. So I think we started to get into the third question, which was around, I believe, I'm not recalling what the third question was right now, but I'll leave it there. And if my colleagues, I think Dr. Philippe is still on the line, or Hamilton, have anything they'd like to add, I'd like to give them the opportunity to do so as well.
Brittany, if I may, if Dr. Philippe or Mr. Hamilton isn't in, and I apologize, during the breakout session, I had another matter I had to deal with, but I just want to second my support for that concept and extend it to a project that we are constantly waiting on JEF funding, but essentially establishing more detailed information about the environment and climate in the Bahamas, because one of the fundamentals with the Bahamas is its archipelagic nature. And so you have very different scenario in Grand Bahama as opposed to Nagua. And so in order to really get at what types of interventions and impacts are occurring or could occur, I think we need to be able to have more fine-grained resolution to what is happening. And so to the extent that this program that looks at surveillance helps to get more data, I think that's aligned with what we other projects. And also we're establishing an eco-informatics laboratory that will start to store all of that information, utilize things like artificial intelligence, deep learning, remote sensing, to start to make decisions about the environment, but also social decisions and ultimately decisions about health.
Thank you very much, Carlton. I think it was Carlton. Carlton, yeah. Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, Carlton.
Do we have any feedback, Vincent, for Brittany and Carlton from the Bahamas regarding that project?
Well, I was in that group, so
okay.
Where I contributed to, well, I hope I did, to some elements of it. I think that as we go into the other questions and discuss the broader issues in terms of the situational analysis, especially the problem statement and the barrier and so on, it will become clearer in terms of how this initiative could be best presented. Maybe it could be augmented by some other elements to as it were make it a more a bigger, more robust initiative that we can add on these elements to. So you have a more comprehensive type program that you're going with, because it's important to recognize that if you're going to go to the GCF with a proposal, you need to go with a proposal that that has a level of substance, right? So it has to be a sufficiently robust and full comprehensive proposal as much as possible. Otherwise, some of those things that have been mentioned, you try to pitch for them within your readiness or through a PPF arrangement. Over.
Thank you, Vincent. Ryan, do you have anything to add to that potential project concept?
No, Keisha, thanks.
I'm preempting your authority, Madam Chair, is that I would certainly want to encourage participants, to having had the experience of today, if they can, take some time and work on the log frame, the baseline document overnight, and set out some more their ideas on this, having benefited from some of the discussion in the plenary and some of the other ideas from other groups. So when we come tomorrow, they would come with a more elaborated idea that we could then take and use as a basis to flesh out some more, to the extent possible, of course, within the discussion on the theory of change, the practicum on the theory of change, and the investment criteria, and the environmental and social safeguards, and the gender issues.
Thank you, Vincent. And so at this time, we're supposed to end at 11:15, so we did make up a bit of time. I was asking if there was any other questions, anybody needed anything clarified on the presentations today before we go into the wrap up. You can always put it in the chat as well. I want to remind you that the presentations as well as the recording of today's session will be sent to you today, so you can take a look at it if you need to review it, perhaps while you're working on filling out the baseline logical framework or the situational analysis aspect of that. So you will get those today, and then tomorrow you'll also, those will be available. Tomorrow's session will also be available to you. So just a little bit of the recap. So today we went through using the GCF concept note as the benchmark. We went through a bit of their process in terms of how to develop a situational analysis. Ryan talked about the situational analysis being how you tell the story, how climate change is impacting or has potential to impact, in this case, the health sector, and looking at perhaps projects that will meet adaptation needs, projects that will meet also mitigation, and of course have co-benefits. So basically you're developing a climate rationale. Why is it you need the GCF to be able to provide funding for this project so that you can address some of the barriers to implementing the things you need to do to better adapt to climate change, and also to move towards a more low carbon development future. So I want to encourage you, like I said, to work on your project ideas and to develop this situational analysis using the questions in the Excel sheet as a guide. And then of course we had Vincent who was supposed to present tomorrow, but we had to make that quick change. So Vincent presented on the GCF investment criteria. So ensuring that your project that you're proposing looks at things like the potential for impact, the impact potential, how much of an impact it will have, the sustainable development potential, so meeting some of the goals of sustainable development, as well as the paradigm shifting. Is it a new way of doing things? And of course, things like country ownership, ensuring that it is in alignment with your various frameworks and policies and strategies for your country. And so it can address those strategies. So tomorrow we will have two presentations. Tomorrow we'll have the presentation from Dr. Kane, who will look at developing the logical framework. And so you go again, you will have a practical session after his presentation, looking at some of the outputs and activities of your potential project, and then further developing that Excel sheet that you have. So you can begin to think from now what maybe some of those potential activities and outputs you'd want to have in that project idea that you're coming up with. And of course, Dr. Kane will guide you through further thinking those through and developing those. And then we will also have a presentation from Ian Morrison, who was with us today. Ian is our environmental and social specialist. So he will look at what are some of the requirements for GCF in terms of the environmental and social considerations, gender considerations and assessments and action plans, etc., which are a key component of any GCF project. So I want to, if nobody else has anything to add, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today from across the region. I think we had a very, very good session, good interaction, and I think our presenters did a great job. So thank you again, and see you all tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Keisha. You have a great, you're from a great location. I love your background.
Thank you, Ian.
All the way 8 stories up.
Thanks.
Thanks, Keisha. Have a nice day. Thanks. Very lovely.
Okay.
Moderation. Have a nice day.